You're listening to episode 191 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Dr. Rick Hanson returns to speak with us about his new book, Hardwiring Happiness, the new brain science of contentment, calm, and confidence. Our practice is a tricky one. It goes against the stream, it takes effort, and sometimes that effort itself isn't really clear. Are we trying to get somewhere, make a change, or are we perfect, just as we are? Of course, we do suffer. Bare attention alone is a starting point, providing a wonderful learning springboard from which bhavana, or development, can occur. But what does that mean in contemporary terms? Rick Hanson, PhD, is a neuropsychologist and author of Hardwiring Happiness, the new brain science of contentment, calm, and confidence. Founder of the Wellspring Institute for Neuroscience and Contemplative Wisdom, and affiliate of the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley, he's taught at Oxford, Stanford, and Harvard, and in meditation centers in Europe, North America, and Australia. An authority on self-directed neuroplasticity, Dr. Hanson's work has been featured on the BBC, NPR, Consumer Reports Health, and U.S. News and World Report, and his articles have appeared in Tricycle Magazine, Insight Journal, and Inquiring Mind. A summa cum laude graduate of UCLA, Dr. Hanson is a trustee of Saybrook University. He has also served on the board of Spirit Rock Meditation Center for 9 years, began meditating in 1974, trained in several traditions, and leads a weekly meditation gathering in San Rafael, California. I'd also like to thank Jenna Chandler for her efforts in coordinating today's interview. So sit back, relax, and have a nice mint chamomile tea. Our returning guest is Dr. Rick Hanson. Rick, welcome back.
Ted, it is really good to be here.
Always good to be speaking with you. Now, you were last with us for episode 99 on your book, Just One Thing, Developing a Buddha Brain One Simple Practice at a Time. And we got to speak a bit on that episode about Buddha's brain, the practical neuroscience of happiness, love, and wisdom. Today, we're speaking about your new book, Hardwiring Happiness, the new brain science of contentment, calm, and confidence. Oh, I like that title. How is this book a bit different than the previous ones that we've enjoyed?
Thank you. Well, I would say this book really is a deep dive, to put it a certain way, into the second and third noble truths in Buddhism. In other words, what this book's about is how to actually turn passing mental states into lasting neural traits that are the underlying neural basis of the wholesome factors of mind and heart that we want to cultivate in ourselves, both for everyday well-being and healing from old pain, as well as, of course, resilience and coping and so forth, as well as to cultivate, in a Buddhist frame, various factors of awakening, such as concentration or tranquility or mindfulness or investigation or even bliss, or cultivating other qualities of mind and heart, such as compassion, loving kindness, equanimity, patience, wisdom, sila, virtue, and so forth, that are well valued in the Buddhist path. And the takeaway from all that for me is to really look at the second and third noble truths. The second truth, as people know, of the cause of suffering being craving, broadly defined, rooted in the Pali word thirst, tanha. And craving comes from a state of deficit or disturbance. So then if you think about the third noble truth, the good news that there really is the possibility of coming to the end of craving, the real question is how, in the context of evolutionary neuropsychology, given that we as animals pretty much are designed to spend a lot of time craving and suffering in order to survive and pass on genes that pass on genes. So how do we actually operationalize in neuropsychological terms the third noble truth, the end of craving, and therefore the end of that cause of suffering and harm? Well, my own view is that the repeated internalization of the felt sense of our three fundamental needs met for safety, satisfaction, and connection, the repeated internalization of the felt sense of those needs met gradually undoes the underlying states of deficit and disturbance that drive the craving that leads to suffering and harm. It doesn't mean that through repeated internalization of positive experiences, through the repeated internalization or cultivation of wholesome factors, that alone is enlightenment. But it's a major aid in that journey. So written for a very mainstream audience without any particularly explicit references to Buddhism, for me, it's actually a deeply Buddhist book that really gets at what I think of as the essence of the Four Noble Truths, the second and third noble truths, and how to actually increasingly internalize and enact the third noble truth through everyday life. That was a mouthful.
It was very well said, mouthful, though. And I like the way that in the book itself, you don't really go into Buddhist concepts explicitly, but as someone or anyone picking up the book with a background, reading this will see the Dhamma in this very clearly. And that's one of the things I appreciate about this is that it's not something that's going to turn off a Buddhist practitioner. It's going to enliven their practice with a new contemporary way of looking at it while still being open to everyone. That's one of the nice things about it.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And one of the things that I felt is that, particularly inside, if you will, a natural frame or the naturalist frame or the naturalizing frame, if you will, of secular Buddhism, inside that frame, obviously the Buddha was engaging the same human brain and the same human DNA and the same evolutionary adaptations woven into the fabric of our being over, 600 million years of evolution of the nervous system on top of another 3 billion years or so of life on the planet. The Buddha was engaging the same brain, the same body, the same DNA, the same evolutionary legacy that we're engaging 2,500 years later. And so being able to talk about the natural processes of states of drive and deficit and disturbance and natural processes of structure building inside the brain, and also natural processes in which the brain has a negativity bias, in which it's very efficient at turning bad experiences into neural structure and much less efficient at turning good experiences into neural structure. And even though good experiences are the primary source of the positive neural structures we need for everyday life, let alone, spiritual practice, we can talk about those natural processes, I think, in a very unapologetic, plain English, down to earth, very direct way. And we can do that, in my view, without falsifying the Dharma or being inauthentic about it. I deliberately am not, jumping up and down saying, see, this is the second noble truth. See, this is one of the paramis. See, this is one of the Brahma Viharas. See, this is one of the factors of awakening. But, in plain English, we can still talk about, for example, investigation, mindfulness, concentration, and tranquility as factors for any kind of mental health or healing.
Now, in the book, and you've talked about this in various talks that you've given, you say that we're Teflon for the positive things that happen and Velcro for the negative. And you just made a reference kind of to how that works or that happens in the brain. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means and how that works neurologically?
Sure. Well, it's interesting that in the context of one of the, of course, as you know, three primary characteristics of existence, perhaps the primary characteristic being impermanence, there's this interesting dynamic in the brain in which transient, dependently arising mental neural states. I'm doing mental neural as if there's a hyphen between mental and neural. They co-arise, and there's an immaterial flow of information, a small fraction of which is subjective conscious experience that's supported, that's enabled by, that entails some kind of underlying pattern of material neural activity. So the two co-arise. In traditional language, nama and rupa, immaterial mental activity, and material form, nama and rupa, co-arise as two aspects of one interdependently arising unified mind-brain system, if you will. Okay, we have this impermanent, ephemeral, dependently arising mental neural pattern. Well, that mental neural pattern can leave relatively permanent traces behind. So we have this tension between fleeting, impermanent mental neural states and relatively permanent, lasting neural traits, neural structures. And this process of converting mental neural states into lasting neural traits is called by scientists experience-dependent neuroplasticity. Okay, so far so good. The question becomes, though, what's the difference between a negative mental neural state and a positive one? Well, it's a big difference because as our ancestors evolved, to put it a certain way, they needed to both get carrots and avoid sticks, right? They needed to get carrots like food, mating opportunities, and they needed to avoid sticks like predators, aggression inside bands, between bands, natural hazards, and so forth. But the difference between carrots and sticks is this. If you fail to get a carrot today, you'll have a chance of one tomorrow. But if you fail to avoid that stick today, that predator, that aggression, that injury, that accident, whack, no more carrots forever. So the brain has evolved what scientists call a negativity bias, in which first, it's continually scanning for bad news. Second, it isolates down upon that bad news when it finds it and loses sight of the larger whole, which if you think of it as a kind of delusion, if you will, or ignorance in a Buddhist frame. Third, what the brain does is it reacts very intensely to bad news. It tends to react more intensely to bad news than to good news. For example, if you play two sounds for a person that are equally loud, but one is pleasant, like the sound of a gong, and the other is unpleasant, like the sound of a car alarm, the brain will react more to the unpleasant sound. And then fourth, for our purposes, very centrally, the brain will take that whole package of stimulus and overreaction and fast track it into emotional memory. Once burned, twice shy. Never forget. And then fifth, gradually over time, repeated negative experiences will increasingly sensitize the brain to the negative. So it actually gets even faster and more intense and more efficient at turning negative moments, negative states, into lasting negative traits like anxiety, irritability, feeling stressed, feeling keyed up, feeling frazzled, feeling sad, feeling depleted, and so forth. That's a great to keep animals alive in harsh conditions, which were the conditions in which our ancestors evolved and in which early humans, and even frankly until very recently across most of the world, modern humans live. And even today, if you're in a combat environment or living in a really tough neighborhood or in a crazy family growing up, having this negativity bias is actually adaptive. It helps keep you alive. But if people are having normal range lives, especially these days, and also especially if people want to grow psychologically and spiritually, this negativity bias gets in the way. Because for one, it creates a lot of unnecessary suffering for individuals and a lot of unnecessary conflict between individuals and frankly scaled up between groups, including between nations. And also, if you want to cultivate, because Buddhism is a path of growth, if you want to develop more wisdom inside yourself, if you want to develop more concentration and mindfulness inside yourself, if you want to develop more virtue inside yourself, the three great pillars of Buddhist practice, as you know. Well, how do we do that? How do we grow the good inside ourselves? Very interestingly, the neural traits, the positive neural traits that we acquire are primarily acquired through positive experiences that are turned into neural structure. In other words, if you want to develop more mindfulness, have more moments of being mindful. If you want to cultivate more joy as a factor of concentration, more tranquility, more contentment, have more moments in which you feel joyful or contented, in moments in which those states are turned into traits, those fleeting experiences are actually registered in some way to become lasting neural structure. The problem, though, is that because of this bias that the brain has, which was a design feature, as our ancestors evolved, but today as a kind of bug, this bias in the brain gets in the way of. It's a kind of fundamental bottleneck in the brain that blocks the conversion of positive mental states to positive neural traits, even though positive neural traits are primarily built from positive mental states. Most positive mental states are wasted on the brain. That's the dirty little secret in mindfulness training. Psychotherapy, I say that as a longtime therapist who's guilty of this himself. Parenting, corporate consulting, coaching, and whatnot. We tend to be very good at activating useful mental states, but relatively poor at helping those mental states become installed in lasting neural structure. So there's learning, there's change, there's growth. That's what my book's about. It's really about the how of taking charge of the structure building processes of your own brain from the inside out, which is both the essence of self-reliance in a very conventional sense and the essence of the upper reaches of human potential.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about that process itself. That is a key component. And I was seeing some ties with the Eightfold Path in some of what you were discussing and what's in the book. With your acronym HEAL, it's a foundational element of the work. And this book refreshes that with some living examples in every chapter. So tell us about HEAL for the audience that hasn't heard that yet.
Well, thank you. What I've attempted to do is simply engage the question of, how do we move from the second noble truth to the third noble truth? Or more generally, how, given the brain that we've got inside a natural frame, a secular frame, how do we grow sila, samadhi, and panya inside? How do we grow virtue, mindfulness, and concentration and wisdom inside? Or how do we actually grow wise view? How do we grow wise intention? How do we support wise effort? How do we cultivate wise speech and so forth? How do we grow loving kindness or compassion or joy at the welfare of others or equanimity? How do we actually grow those? So what I've done is drawn upon many, many studies in the neuropsychology of learning. In other words, any kind of growth is a matter of learning, which is to say a change of some kind in neural structure and function. So how do we get good changes going in terms of neural structure and function? Well, I think that process is really summarized as a two-stage matter that moves from activation to installation, in which activated mental states become installed as neural traits. I alluded to that already. And that then can create possibilities of cycles in which positive states can become installed as positive traits, and then positive traits foster positive states, which can then be reinstalled as traits. Okay, how do we do this? How do we actually create those good traits inside? Well, that's where the HEAL acronym, HEAL, comes in. The first letter H stands for have a positive, useful state of mind in the first place. Usually because you just notice you're already having one, Like right now, I'm feeling kind of excited and interested. I've always enjoyed talking with you, Ted. I think you're performing a great service here. That's a good experience, right? That's already happening. Or a person can deliberately create a positive experience, a useful experience, such as through the deliberate practice of loving kindness or compassion, or perhaps calling up a time in their life when they were very strong and determined, because maybe they've got to be assertive with somebody, or they might call up a sense inside of others who love them as a way to navigate a situation where they've been let down or mistreated or put down by somebody else. Okay, now you're having that useful mental state. That's great. But how do you not waste it on your brain? How do you help it become some kind of lasting structure? That's where the other three letters of the HEAL acronym come in. E stands for enrich. You can enrich the experience through one or more of 5 well-known factors that promote learning, including emotional learning, change in underlying implicit memory. Those factors are duration. As you know well, there's a famous saying in brain science, neurons that fire together wire together. So the longer you get those neurons firing, the more likely they are to build structure. Second factor of enriching is intensity. The more intensely the experience is felt, or the more intensely those neurons are firing, the more they're going to tend to wire together. Third factor is multimodality. The more we feel the experience in the body, the more we have it be emotional rather than merely conceptual, the more we even enact it, such as leaning forward to intensify an experience of engagement or assertiveness, for example, or putting a hand on the heart to intensify an experience of compassion or loving kindness, for example. Well, the more we engage the multimodality of an experience, the more we'll enrich it, the more structure we'll build. The fourth factor is novelty. The more we can look at our experiences in the saying beginner's mind, Zen mind, or looking at our experience with the eyes of a child, the more that's going to build structure. Also, last, personal relevance. Why would this matter to me? For example, to have internalized a felt sense of being cared about by other people, or to have internalized a commitment to wise speech in my relationships. How would that really help me? Well, if you're clear about its personal relevance, again, much research has shown, you're more likely to turn it into neural structure, something of lasting value, so that it's not wasted on your brain. And then the A in the HEAL acronym stands for A for absorb. You can intensify the memory-making processes in your own brain by intending to really register an experience. I mean, the process I'm describing is the embodied registration of experience so that it has some kind of lasting value for a person. So people do the absorb step in different ways. A lot of them, like me, do it visually. You just kind of imagine or see or sense that this experience is going into you. With kids, I might talk about putting a jewel in the treasure chest of the heart. Adults too, of course. Or you can just simply know that this is becoming a part. Okay, those first three steps, to quickly summarize, to use the metaphor of a fire, are like lighting a fire so you have it in the first place, and then enriching the fire and protecting it and keeping it burning by adding logs to it and not letting anything put it out, not letting yourself get distracted. And then in the third step, absorb, you warm yourself at the fire. You help it sink into you. Now, all that sounds kind of complicated. It really boils down to have it, enjoy it, and it also really boils down to, in most cases, 10 or 20 or 30 seconds in the flow of everyday life. Mo better. That's two words right there. Mo better. More moments in which you're registering useful experiences, and inside any single episode in which you're registering a useful experience, more density or depth of engagement. Mo better. And then if you want, the optional fourth step of the HEAL acronym, HEAL, link, is one in which you hold both positive and negative material in awareness at the same time. So that since, quote unquote, neurons that fire together wire together, you can gradually associate the positive experience, such as feeling cared about, to the negative material, let's say not feeling so cared about. Right? Any single time you do this process will probably not change your life. The structure building processes of experience-dependent neuroplasticity are generally slow and incremental, but bit by bit, synapse by synapse, half a dozen or more times a day, usually half a minute or less at a time, less than 5 minutes a day, you can gradually, increasingly install and grow wholesome qualities inside yourself. Also, the process itself will have bonus benefits because it calls us to have more mindful awareness. And also, we need to be on our own side, which is really important. We need to be kind to ourselves, treat ourselves like we matter. And then last, new research is beginning to suggest the possibility that much as the brain can become gradually sensitized to the negative through negative experiences, it can be gradually sensitized to the positive through repeatedly internalizing positive experiences in implicit memory.
I also wanted to thank you for providing citations for many of the things that you say throughout the book that you've been saying now, that it's based in evidence. And I wanted to ask if you found that to be a helpful resource for readers, if folks have reached out to you to say, yeah, that I was wondering what you meant there, and that explained it, and I checked that out, and that enriched my understanding of what you were talking about.
Yeah, two things here, Ted. So first, with regard to the citations, thanks for picking that out. And, you don't need a citation to know that it feels good to drink water when you're thirsty, right? And I think there can be a little bit of tendency in our culture to take the stand that something isn't valid or useful just because there's no study for it. It's interesting, a detail here, literally the recognized position within mainstream institutional medicine is that roughly half of all the procedures that physicians or other healthcare professionals employ in both hospital settings and outpatient settings, roughly half of all the procedures of various kinds that are used do not have one single study behind them. That doesn't mean they're malpractice. They're actually part of the standard of care, the accepted standard of care. But there's no double-blind, a longitudinal study or any kind of study actually that backs them up. But they're still reasonable and they still work. All that said, yeah, it was important for me to have citations and for people to appreciate that positive experiences, which are very easy to poo poo or sneer at, are actually the building blocks of building up the positive traits inside, like resilience, determination, character virtues, and so forth, that really we need to deal with what's negative. My own take on things is not to have positive thinking, it's to have realistic thinking with a brain that's frankly biased toward negative thinking. Second point, from a Buddhist practice standpoint, the experience of taking in the good, which is kind of my homespun phrase for the heal process, for this process of deliberately internalizing positive experiences in emotional memory, in implicit memory. What taking in the good feels like is a kind of intimacy with yourself in which you are very surrendered to your experience, you're very open to your experience, you are animating qualities of compassion and loving kindness for yourself among all beings. And simultaneously, even as you're very grounded in a mindful receptivity that can feel even kind of luscious, in which you're given over to this generally enjoyable, useful experience for yourself, simultaneously, you're letting go. You're releasing it so that the gradual taking in of these useful, positive experiences undoes craving. Over time, cultivation undoes craving because as a person increasingly internalizes the felt sense of these core needs being met, for safety, satisfaction, and connection, the needs any animal has, including complicated ones like us, as people actually internalize that over time, their happiness, their well being, their loving kindness, their wisdom becomes increasingly unconditional, not based on external conditions. And over time, even the practice of cultivation falls away, like the metaphorical raft that we construct to get across the river of suffering, but then we don't keep carrying around once we get to the other side.
So you also have some good resources on your websites, and there are a couple of those for us to talk about. Do you want to take a few minutes and just tell us about some of those?
Oh, I'll just say it very briefly. Tons and tons of resources are freely offered at rickhanson.net. And for those who have general interest, or particularly for those with a Buddhist interest, I have a lot of talks and in particular, and also some writings that are very relevant. I have a regular sitting group, and I also go around and teach a fair amount at Buddhist centers. And so those resources are also very freely offered and freely available to people. A key point I would also add to people is that you can use these practices of cultivation during your own formal meditation. For example, if you're registering or starting to have kind of an opening to a new place inside, or maybe there's a growing insight into something, or, my own practice these days, it's a lot about you sort of an opening out into wholeness. And it's the way I would describe it, with some kind of engagement with an intuition of unconditionality, for lack of a better word. Words start to fail at these edges, as you know, Ted. Anyway, when that's happening, when there's like a greater opening or some shift, I try to help it land inside, or maybe at the end of a meditation setting, when a person's in a good place, kind of help that land inside, help it sink in. So what you're doing really, minute by minute, in a sense, is steepening your own learning curve as you proceed through life. As they say in Tibet, if you take care of the minutes, the years will take care of themselves. And that's really what we're talking about here. What is a person's practice of helping the wholesome minutes or even moments in everyday life gradually be registered in this brain that unfortunately is overly good at learning from the bad and not very good at learning from the good, right? I think about the Buddha's teaching given in the Dhammapada, this lovely quote, I don't know if you know it, I suspect you might. He says in the Dhammapada, think not lightly of good, saying, it will not come to me. Drop by drop is the water pot filled. Likewise, the wise one, gathering it little by little, fills oneself with good.
It's one of my favorite quotes in the Dhammapada.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that.
It's a wonderful, wonderful quote. And it really, for folks who may be thinking, oh, we're just grasping at at happy places. It's not that we're we're uncovering the unconditioned, to put it in Buddhist terms.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if we are to enable ourselves to deal with the hard things, old age, disease, and death, to deal with social injustice, or to deal with things like global warming, if we're going to deal with these things, we need to be strong. We need to grow strengths inside. Clearly, and my own take on Buddhist practice is that a major component of it is simply being with whatever is there. All right. Also, though, if you look at the wise effort element of the Noble Eightfold Path, a major aspect of Buddhist practice is to release what's negative and to grow what's positive, the cultivation aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path. And I don't think the cultivation that we've spoken of in my books about is the entirety of the path. I don't think that at all. But even if you're going to simply be with your experience in a kind of choiceless awareness way, you need to cultivate inner qualities to be able to do that. Otherwise, you get swept away by the stream of consciousness. So one of my own personal opinions is that the stance of pure witnessing has gotten overvalued in Buddhism in the last 20, 30 years. And it's appropriate now for a kind of corrective where we have more of a focus on the sila aspect of practice, where we release what's unwholesome. And also, as part of sila, as well as bhavana or cultivation more generally, we look at how to actually cultivate more wholesome qualities of mind and heart, to further ourselves and also to have more inside ourselves that we can offer to others.
Yeah, that's one of the stumbling blocks I sometimes have in centers that do have a valid point, that bare attention is a good thing. And yes, that's a step on the path, but there's more to it than that. There's what stood out to me in reading your book. I was just feeling the theme and hearing the words around recognize that negative states that have occurred and don't let any more come up, and reduce the ones that have, and positive states, foster the ones that have and have more. That's part of the practice. We don't need to stop at just experiencing that things are great right now or they suck right now. We can also transform ourselves and our response to moment by moment existence.
That's exactly right. I mean, for me, just to wrap up here, because I know we've got to end, kind of the takeaway question for me is someone, I started meditating in 1974. That was a while ago. Bottom line, what's a person's learning curve? What's my learning curve? I ask myself that every day. How am I helping myself to not be such a jerk? And also to suffer less, and also to cultivate those good qualities inside. And maybe we can wrap on this point. That's what my book's about. It's basically about the how of personal growth, the how of learning how to learn. Because I think that is what, in a way, that's the X factor. That's the meta factor, where you learn how to learn. And then you can help yourself and others as a result.
And that was my own practice objective in a retreat I just returned from, was getting out of my own way, as you're saying. So we do have a video on the episode page for this episode, Take in the Good. And Rick, that's you at Chicago Ideas Week.
Oh, good. Okay.
And also please be sure, for folks who are listening, to check out Rick's websites, rickhanson.net. That's the SON.net. And for the Wellspring Institute for Neuroscience and Contemplative Wisdom is wisebrain.org. Rick, thanks for being here.
Ted, wonderful to be here, and best wishes to everyone listening.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.